Hi everyone, my name is Omar Kashad. I'm one of the Adult Services Librarians here at the Carroll Stream Public Library, and here I am. Hi everyone, thanks for coming out for this Gamera presentation today. We're going to be talking about Gamera, the giant monster. He's a giant turtle, and he is celebrating his 60th anniversary this year. He started out in 1965 and has been continuing in films and off and on until the present day, as well as one TV series. And you will believe that a turtle can fly. So yeah, Gamera's been active from 1965 to the present, and of course we're talking about monsters, aliens, and Gauss. Oh my! And if that means nothing to you, we will get to that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera back off, and thank you for joining us on this journey. If you had seen this presentation when I gave it live earlier, I will not be showing the YouTube clips on this presentation, but just because for copyright reasons. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera, and we're going to go ahead and get going. Let's see Gamera. Well, here he is. Gamera is a giant turtle, as we can see. He's got arms, he's got legs, he's got tusks, he's got a shell. He's taller than most buildings. So that is Gamera, who we all hopefully know and love. So going by the numbers a little bit, why is he called Gamera? Well, Gamera is a combination portmanteau of the word kame, which is Japanese for turtle, and ra, which was typically used for the ending of most of some giant monsters like Gojira, Mosura, which is Gojira is Japanese for Godzilla, Mosura is Japanese for Mothra, but Kojira is not a monster. That is the Japanese word for whale, which is the raw part from the whale went into Gojira to come up with his name. Now, important to note though is that the Godzilla franchise and the Gamera franchise, those are owned by two different studios. So it's sort of like think of it like Marvel and DC. Iron Man is not owned by the same company that owns Superman. But Gamera is a kaiju, which is Japanese for giant monster. And he breathes fire. He can also breathe fireballs. He flies. He has tusks and he has opposable thumbs. His height is anywhere between 60 to 80 meters tall, which is between 197 to 262 feet. That's typically shorter than Godzilla is typically depicted, but his years active, he was active from originally from 1965 to 1971. They made another film in 1980, and then they made a trilogy between 1995 to 1999. There was one final Gamera film as of this recording in 2006, and then in 2023 they made a Godzilla. They made a Gamera TV series for Netflix. Was lasted about 6 episodes. Gamera was been in 12 films throughout this time. He was in one TV series. The studio who made it originally was called, I might be butchering this pronunciation, Daiei Pictures. They went bankrupt over the years, and now they were bought out by a company called Katakawa, and now they're known as Katakawa Daiei Studios. Now, warning though, will be some spoilers in this presentation. Also, because we're talking about 60 years of history, and there just has not been much written about Gamera in the United States, there may be some urban legends in this presentation. But just know I'm not going to lie to you about anything. It's just some stuff I say. Like I said, it may just be an urban legend. But what is Gamera? Well, is Gamera the friend and protector of all children? Possibly. Again, I'm not going to show this clip. Or is he also the guardian of the universe as he was depicted in the 1990s? Possibly. Or just maybe is he the brunt of jokes on Mystery Science Theater 3000? And if you don't know Mystery Science Theater 3000 is, we'll get to that a little bit later. But let's talk about Gamera's first steps, though, which is basically the kaiju craze, that should say craze, not crazy, of the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond. Of course, we have to talk about Godzilla. We have to talk about the elephant in the room. We have to talk about Godzilla. And if you're a big Gamera film, you're probably saying boo to Godzilla. But I like Godzilla and Gamera. And this is just a video online of someone who did an animated version of Gamera fighting Godzilla. There's never been any Godzilla versus Gamera movie ever officially made. But was Gamera specifically, though, a Godzilla competitor? And to that, the answer is no. Not specifically, at any rate. Basically, when the first Godzilla movie came out, it did really well at the box office. And then when they took it to America, it made American money when it was in theaters in America. It was sort of like the first Japanese movie to actually actually be considered mainstream in America. So because it was making American money, that's when a lot of studios got on board and said we want to release our own giant monster movies. So by this point, the giant monster movies have been super popular on the movie screens. They were starting to make their way to TV. But it was sort of starting to fizzle out to a degree by this point. Again, kaiju is basically Japanese for giant monster. As far as the Godzilla franchise goes, Godzilla, Rodan, Mothra, Ghidorah, they'd all been introduced prior to 1965 when the first Gamera film came out. And it's also important to note, though, is that some consider that the Showa Godzilla series, the early Godzilla films, that they peaked creatively this year with Godzilla versus Monster Zero in 1965. This was sort of the last year that most of the Godzilla movies up to this point have been made with the same group of people behind the scenes: the director, the producer, sometimes the writer, the composer, the special effects guy. Well, this is the last of the string of movies that they had made together in succession. I think they made like 5 out of the last 6 Godzilla movies or something like that. But anyway, so that they say it was peak creatively the same year as the first Gamera film came out. But before we got to the movie coming out, we had a misstep first before Gamera's release, and that was Nezura in 1964. You're probably looking at this and saying, wait, is that a giant rat monster? And guess what? You'd be right. But you'd also be wrong in the sense that, you're probably thinking, well, I never heard of this movie. Well, you never heard of it because it never came out. What happened is before Gamera was envisioned as a giant turtle, he was envisioned as a giant rat called Nezura. So in the movie, the way they were going to film it was they were going to have like a bunch of giant rats terrorizing like a fake cityscape, and then I believe their giant rat king was going to then emerge as a guy in a suit. Well, the rats that were going to be terrorizing the city were going to be like like not human rats. They're going to be like live rats, and then they were going to destroy a cityscape, and then again, the giant rat king would be a guy in a suit. Well, because this movie didn't have a lot of budget allocated to it, because I don't think Daiei really could put that much money into it, someone's like, well, where are we going to get the rats from to destroy the cityscape? Trained rats are expensive. And that's when someone else on the crew was like, oh, I know where we'll get the rats from. We'll just get them off the street and off the sewers. And that sounds horrifying, and that's exactly what they did. So they got a bunch of rats off these streets and the sewers, and they put them into their movie, and they started filming some scenes with it. And shortly thereafter, the whole production got shut down by health and safety, especially after the rats got out and infested the whole studio. So yeah, so that was a bad idea in hindsight, and so yeah, I don't know footage of this exists of what they filmed. But what happened though was a few years ago is because this story is so well known, at least in Japan, at least, and to a degree in America too, for those who know their giant monster movies. They did like some Japanese actors did a lighthearted take on the filming of the whatever on the filming of the original Nezura. So it's sort of like Spinal Tap to a degree. So this is the movie poster for that mockumentary, if you will, of Nezura. So I think you can watch this Nezura take their take on Nezura in 1964. Again, it's not that them filming like what Nezura could have been. It's saying we're going to film the filming of Nezura, and then I think they did have like a guy in a rat suit. I think they did build the rat suit, and then they actually used train rats in this production. They did not make the same mistake twice, but I saw some of it, and it was a pretty fun movie. But then why did Gamera become a turtle? Well, per the movie's producer and head of the studio, on a plane ride, he envisioned a turtle flying beside his plane, which is possibly a cloud that he saw that maybe looked like a turtle. Um, on a side note, though, is that Godzilla was also envisioned similarly by producer Tomoyuki Tanaka. He was on a plane ride back from Korea, I think, flying to Japan, and he looked down at the ocean and thought, well, what if there was a giant monster swimming below the waters? Now, my personal thoughts though are that children in Japan would often like to keep small animals as pets. In the first movie, we see that Toshio, or as he's referred to in America, Kenny, in the English dub, he had a pet turtle. Now, alternatively, though, in Chinese mythology, and I'm not too familiar with the concept of the Four Guardians, but there's a concept called the Four Guardians, which you can look up later on your own time. Basically refers to constellations and the stars. Well, the four guardians are all each an animal, and the one to the north is a black turtle. The reason why I think this has some relevance is that in the beginning of the first Gamera film, Japanese scientists they visit an Eskimo village in the north, and they are given a tablet depicting a fictitious ancient beast called Gamera from their mythology. So that brings us to the Showa era, which went from 1965 to 1971, and also had one final film in 1980. And we start out with Gamera the Giant Monster in 1965. Now you're looking at that below saying it was brought to the U.S. as now it was brought to Gamera was brought to the U.S. in the following year as Gamera the Invincible with two M's. So no, that's not a typo. There are supposed to be two M's there, and we're going to get to that English version in just a little bit later. But here, of course, is Gamera. He's having a good time. He's got his train. Everything's on fire. Stuff like that. Of course, our characters are horrified. I don't believe Gamera ever actually does pick up a train in this film, but it makes for a good visual. Of course, Gamera, as I said before, the way this movie opens is that there's an American, like they got Western Westerners who were living in Japan. They got them to be in the beginning of this movie, and basically there's like a American fighter group American base who finds these unknown enemy planes in their territory or their jurisdiction. They send some American fighter jets after them. They shoot down one of these unknown planes of unknown origin. It crashes into the ice. There's an atomic explosion because it was carrying an atomic bomb. And then Gamera comes straight up out of the ice. What's interesting, though, is that Gamera was not typically depicted as being an atomic monster the way Godzilla was. Godzilla was very much synonymous with nuclear energy in the early days. Gamera just not so. He was just a giant monster. The atomic energy was always a side bit, and I think it was only in this movie too that they ever actually referred to atomic energy. Of course, then Gamera can also fly. Again, I can't show you this clip either, but basically what happens is Gamera retracts his arms and his legs into his shell and his head, and basically can fire jets out of where his arms and his legs were in his shell, and he basically can spin around like a flying saucer. In this movie, his spinning around as a flying saucer was primarily depicted in animated form, but later on, but in the other films, it was just basically like the prop that was spinning around. So this movie sort of feels like a little bit of an outlier, seeing Gamera flying around because again, it was animated in the first film. But then later on, Gamera would gain the ability to just retract in his legs, and he could fly around with his arms and his head out, which allowed them to do more with the flying scenes. And it's sort of like, in a sense, like Superman flying, with the arms and the legs out, or arms and his head out. Obviously, Superman doesn't retract his legs, but the idea of him flying looks very similar to Superman. Now, what finally happened to Gamera in this film? What was he finally sent into? And for that, I will say no spoilers here. Watch the movie instead. One production note though is that this movie was filmed in black and white in order to save money, even though the Godzilla series, again one of their competitors, had been in color. In fact, the Godzilla series has been in color for a while now. The first Toho monster, again Toho was responsible for Godzilla. Their first colored monster movie was Rodan in 1956. So you're looking at like a series by this point had been in color for 9 years, and your movie is not in color. And because it was not a huge budget, and it wasn't in color, and maybe things like that, those who were working on this movie, they didn't think this movie was going to do very well at the box office, but it did. So who was one of those people who thought it wasn't going to do all that well? Well, one of them was the movie's director. So Gamera was directed by a man named Noriaki Yuasa. Like Ishiro Honda, who had directed the Godzilla films, he honestly thought that this he was told by people that he knew not to direct this movie because he thought they thought it would ruin his career, just like Ishiro Honda, who did the first Godzilla movie, was told not to do this movie because they thought it would ruin his career. But Yuasa, he was involved with this film. In fact, he was involved with every Showa era Gamera film. The only movie that he didn't direct was the first sequel, Gamera versus Baragon, but he did supervise the special effects, and I believe he also supervised some of the special effects as well, or at least oversaw them, in the Gamera movies that he directed as well. Um, Now, the idea of Gamera being a friend to all children in these early films was primarily the came out from the movie's producer and head of the studio, but Yuasa was very much on board with this. To direct quote what he said, this isn't my translation of this, I got it off the internet, but my feelings regarding children come from my childhood experiences. During World War II, most of the adults I knew, including many of my teachers, continually stressed the importance of nationalism. However, after Japan was defeated and many political parties were formed, a teacher of mine switched from being a nationalist to a communist and then started openly advocating communism. This is very traumatic for me, so I made Gamera a guardian whom children could rely on and trust. And we do see that in these films where, the adults, where the children tell the adults about something they saw, like I saw Gamera or I saw aliens or whatever. And the children and the adults don't believe them. But whereas Gamera, he's always there to help save them and help save the day. So here is Yuasa with the Gamera suit there on the left, and there he is with the Virus suit. That's Virus, the giant squid there on the right. Again, trying to again, depict some of the special effects sequences that would be happening. Yuasa was never embarrassed about his work in these films. I think he was very proud of it. In the late 1990s, he actually came to the United States to a convention called G-Fest, and he actually was able to talk on his experiences. I didn't see that, but I did see photos of it. But yeah, so he came to the United States. He passed away, I believe, in the mid 2000s. But he was never embarrassed about the work. I think he was proud of his work on these films. Now, this movie was brought to America the year later, again as Gamera the Invincible. Gamera's how is Gamera pronounced? Well, sometimes it's called Gamera, sometimes it's Gamera, or in one film he's actually referred to as Gamera, Gamera. But Gamera was released in theaters the following years as Gamera the Invincible. Similar to the original Godzilla movie, they added scenes of English of American actors into this film. They inserted scenes. Unlike the first Godzilla movie, though, I don't think this quite worked out as well. They sort of stand out. In fact, There's a funny sequence where a couple of American scientists are sort of spouting a bunch of nonsense, and then two of them get into an argument over Gamera, and it's actually just kind of silly. But anyway, but yeah, so they added scenes of Americans into the film. In fact, at the beginning of the Japanese version, there were some American expat actors who were in that film. You know, like the whole, as I said before, the whole fighter sequence bit and like an American military base. Well, they refilmed all of that. Also because unfortunately the Western actors in the first Gamera film, the Japanese version, they were not professional actors, so their acting was sort of like here and there. But so they replaced all of that. It was actually done by, I believe, a company called American International Pictures, dubbed and did these scenes for the American Western release, at least, or I know they did dub some of the other films. Important to note, though, is that this is the only Gamera film to be widely released theatrically in the United States, because all the other Gamera films would be either straight to television or to video stateside, and that brings us to a man by the name of Sandy Frank. So you're probably like, well, who is Sandy Frank? Well, here he is. This was a long time ago, but he is actually still alive today. He is in his mid 90s, and I think he's actually still producing to some degree various things. But so Sandy Frank. So Sandy Frank, what happened was, so again, when the Gamera films were originally released in the 60s and 70s, they were all dubbed into English by American International Pictures, and then they were broadcast on TV. Well, later on in the 1980s, American television producer Sandy Frank got the TV rights to most of the original Gamera films. Now, some of these movies were later than either redubbed or used a different dub than the American International Picture dubs. But anyway, so he took his films and he sold them in syndication packages to TV stations. So if you're watching Gamera in like the 1980s and the 1990s, and you saw like a movie marathon of Gamera films, it was likely from the film rights that Sandy Frank got his hands onto. Now, when Sandy Frank also acquired the original Gamera, as I said before, it was redubbed, and they took out. In this case, they did the complete opposite, where they took out the American scenes added by International Pictures and just restored all the original American Western actor scenes from the original Gamera. I know that's kind of confusing. It makes more sense when you see the movies, like the Sandy Frank version and the non-Sandy Frank version, the Sandy Frank and the American International Pictures versions, I should say. But anyway, so they include the original Western actors who had been in the Gamera film. Now, supposedly, all his releases are now in the public domain. Sometimes, if you see like you buy like a box set of like 50 sci-fi movies of varying qualities, sometimes his Gamera films are in there. They're not actually in the public domain. It's just I don't think anybody's enforcing it because Sandy Frank's in his 90s, and the DIA doesn't really care. Is sort of my opinion. I mean, it's Gamera. It doesn't make a lot. Unfortunately, Gamera just does not make a lot of money anyway. Which is why I'm also not going to discuss like alternate titles for these films either. Like one movie was called like War of the Monsters, I think. One was called Battle for the Planets or something. I'm just not going to discuss like the English names of these films that they got changed into when they came to the U.S. I'm just going to mainly refer to them by their Japanese names in English, if that makes sense. But the reason why Sandy Frank matters, though, is there was a show called Mystery Science Theater 3000, and it originally started on TV station in Minneapolis by a guy called Joel Hodgson, who was working at the TV station. He thought it'd be funny if he pretended like he was in the audience. So they filmed him in some chairs, like he was watching the movies, and he would make humorous comments about the movies, and whether it was Gamera Gamera or whatever. So what happened though is because Sandy Frank had his syndication package, is that Joel and crew realized that they now had rights to 5 of the Gamera films. What was called riff on them is how he called them. He'd make like humorous comments as he was watching the movies. Well, so what happened was is that the Science Fiction Channel, which later became known as the Sci-Fi Channel, they thought, well, this is a great idea. We wanted to like put more money into Mystery Science Theater 3000, and we're going to have like Joel now be joined by 2 robot friends. And then what happened was is that so basically the movie got riffed twice. It got riffed in season 0 and then again in season 3. Season 0 was in 1988, and then season 3 was 1991 to 1992. And basically the re-releases of when they redid all the riffs on the Gamera films, they were put into their own DVD box set a few years ago. But you can watch all these riffs on YouTube for free or Tubi. Even some of the season 0 riffs are on there as well. And so yeah, so you can watch some of these riffs. The season 0 ones are not quite as good, at least not really, because again they were sort of ad-libbing it. Season 3 is where they actually wrote out the jokes, but regardless, they're both worth watching. I think they're hilarious. I have the themed DVD box set of the Mystery Science Theater 3000 Gamera films, but again, you can watch them free on YouTube or Tubi. Um, Now we're moving on though to the first sequel, which is Gamera versus Baragon in 1965. We're dealing with fire versus ice. Here's Gamera flinging around Baragon in the background, and so we see our 2 protagonists down there at the bottom. I guess they're more interested in each other than they are Gamera flinging around a giant monster. But that's true of a lot of Japanese posters where the main characters are looking at us and not the monsters fighting behind them. This was a higher budgeted Gamera film because Gamera had success at the box office. There were plans for a sequel, so this movie was actually given a higher budget, had a different director, and than Yuasa, and was the first Gamera film that was made in color. They also decided they were going to treat this movie more seriously. This movie is a very dark movie. It doesn't feature any children, and it basically picks Gamera, who's a fire monster, fighting a Baragon or Barugan, who's an ice monster. And I think it's a nice dichotomy between the two of them. But anyway, so basically, this movie didn't do all that well at the box office, though. Children got bored with the lack of Gamera and giant monster fights, and also, again, there were no children in this movie that they could relate to. Gamera was also very animalistic in this film. Usually Gamera is depicted standing upright, on his legs and arms. He looks like a human. Well, in this movie, he almost never stands up. He stands up, I think, like twice. Most of the time, he's just on all fours, and it's just a very brutal fight between him and Baragon in both movies. That said, in both fight scenes, I should say, but the thing though with this film though is this is actually my personal favorite Gamera film, even 30 years after first seeing it on VHS. Now I understand why people don't like it for the same reasons that I like it, and that's perfectly fine. It's just a matter of opinion. But I really like this movie. I still think it's one of my favorites. I could even watch it today. But this also probably features the most infamous kaiju-related human death in history, though, in movie history anyway. The Godzilla franchise rarely depicted Godzilla and the giant monsters killing any of the main characters in the movies. Well, in this one of the characters got dispatched pretty notably. I'm not going to tell you how, but you're going to have to watch the movie to find out. But you're going to know what I'm referring to when you see it. People who saw this movie in the 60s even still remember to this day how one of the characters got taken out by one of the monsters. But I'm not going to show this clip. But anyway, we're moving on now to Gamera versus Gauss in 1967. We had a turtle fighting a giant vampire bat. So here's Gamera, here's Gauss, and this Gauss is one of Gamera's most well-known opponents. But anyway, and here we can see Gamera flying around, as I said, in sort of that Superman pose. This is the first film where he actually did that. Instead of being like the flying saucer. I mean, he still would be the flying saucer too. It's just, here's he's depicted flying, like Superman. Also, this poster makes it seem like there was a giant aerial battle in Gamera versus Gauss when there really wasn't. There was a little bit of Gamera fighting Gauss in the sky, but most of the time they were fighting on the ground, and at no point were any fighter jets involved. But anyway, like I said, the Noriaki Yuasa, they put him back in charge of the Gamera franchise. While the budget was not as high as Gamera versus Baragon, it was still an expensive movie to make. Because Gauss could fire like a little laser beam, and that was a very expensive thing to do on screen, even though it's just like a giant line's coming out. But anyway, yeah, Gauss was Gamera's most well-known opponent. in the movies, and even to this day, he's Gamera's most well-known opponent. Now the thing though is now children again started taking center stage in this movie and all subsequent Showa entries. But even though children were in these movies and the movies were sort of geared towards children, the Gamera films were much more gory and violent than the Godzilla franchise. There was blood everywhere from the monsters, not from the humans. Limbs got cut off. There were some beheadings. Gamera was almost cut in half at one point in a later film. He got chopped up pretty well in most of these movies. And in fact, in this movie, going back to monster on human violence, which the Godzilla franchise didn't have much of, Gauss ate people in this movie, albeit tastefully, no pun intended. Basically, Gauss would pick somebody up, and you hear them screaming, and then you see Gauss's mouth opening and closing a lot, and that was sort of like, even to this day, I still find that a little disturbing. But it's like, it's Gauss ate people. There's no sugarcoating it. Of course, it's not quite as disgusting as Gauss eating people in the 90s, but maybe we'll get to that later. But anyway, moving on. So we had Gamera versus Virus in 1968, which is Reptile versus Calamari. Someone online said that this is Noriaki Yuasa's film that he was most proud of for the Gamera franchise, and I could see that. I mean, I can't say it myself. I haven't done my own research on that, but I could see that. Here's an example of one of the alternate titles, though, Destroy All Planets. I only show this because I own this DVD release of this. This was the first time I was able to see this movie because when I was a kid growing up, I only had reliable access to 3 Gamera films at the video store. Gamera, Gamera versus Baragon, and Gamera versus Giron, which we're going to get to Giron next. But anyway, yeah, I have this DVD even to this day. It's kind of fun. There's Gamera on the left, Virus on the right, Virus' spaceship in the top at the top there because Virus is an alien monster. But in this movie, though, they tried to do more to appeal to U.S. audiences. Again, Yuasa is again directing this film, but so in order to appeal to foreign audiences, decision was made to add Western expatriates who were living in Japan to the cast, and this mostly came about because they'd have an American child acting opposite a Japanese child in these films. And so in this movie, though, it was called that the actor's name was Carl Craig. He was just basically a young boy who was a American Boy Scout in Japan. He was there because his family was living in Japan at the time. And he played a character called Jim Crane, where he acted against a Japanese boy who was a Japanese Boy Scout. Carl Craig, he was never going to be a professional actor, but he is still alive to this day. And there are interviews with him on YouTube talking about being in this movie. Also, he was going to appear at G-Fest this year, although G-Fest has already happened at the time I'm recording this. I presume he showed. I only say that because I know a couple years ago I think he was going to show up, but he couldn't make it for some reason. I presume that he actually did make it this year. I didn't go to Godzilla Fest this year, or G-Fest in Chicago, but he was supposed to appear. But going back to, again, these movies having not very much of a budget, was that they didn't have a lot of budget for these movies, but they also were trying to, again, the kids wanted to see the monsters fight. So how are you going to get more monster footage into these movies, even though you didn't have a lot of budget to film the monster fights that you were going to shoot? Well, they did that through something called stock footage. Stock footage means you take footage from previous Gamera films and you put them into the new film. So in stock footage then allowed them to reuse the fight scenes from the previous Gamera films. So in this movie, you could see Gamera fighting Gauss, and you could see Gamera fighting Baragon, and even I think some shots of the first Gamera film. The conceit, though, for most of this is that Gamera is being mind probed by aliens to learn more about him, which allows them to show the fight footage from the previous films. And then in a later film, the children are the ones being mind probed, so everyone's being mind probed in these movies. But what happened? So then Gamera versus Virus had 3 separate cuts incorporating previous fights to various degrees. There was a theatrical cut, which was like an hour and 12 minutes, which basically had a very short sequence of Gamera's previous fights. There was what's called a director's cut, which also came out in Japan, I think later on, which added 9 minutes of stock footage to the theatrical cut. And then when it came out in the United States, they added even 9 more minutes of stock footage. So basically, you had 18 minutes of stock footage in this in the American version. Which, as a kid, again, I didn't have reliable access to this movie. I had reliable access to the following movie, Gamera versus Giron, which also had stock footage of the previous fights. This was like a double-edged sword. It was a good thing for me, at least as a child, because I could see, fight footage from previous Gamera films that I didn't have access to. It was also a little frustrating because I couldn't see these movies that this footage was from, and I'm trying to put together like what was the plot. I have no idea. The internet was around. I used the internet in those days, but not enough to know how to do research on what was the plot of these previous Gamera films. Plus, you couldn't see any clips of them online either. No YouTube in those days. But then it's also like but then it was also then that's why it was frustrating too. It's like I want to watch these movies which I can't watch because I can't get my hands on them. It was also frustrating for a second reason, which is I'm here to watch Scammer fight the monster in the movie that I'm watching, not him fighting monsters from previous movies. So I want to see Gamera in fight Virus. I want to see Gamera fight Giron. So that's the thing when you binge watch these movies is just know you're probably going to be seeing a lot of footage from previous films. And but again, let's take it also in the context of the 60s. There was no home video craze, so the only way these kids could watch these movies if they were in theaters or maybe occasionally on TV. So I understand why they did it. It's just like I said, it's both a good thing and a bad thing is how I look at it. And even the Godzilla franchise wasn't immune to this either. They would put stock footage into their movies as well. It just wasn't always as egregious as it was in the Gamera franchise, except for a couple films. But anyway, so then of course it brings us to Gamma versus Giron in 1969, which is a half shell versus a giant blade. And what does Giron even mean? I think Giron is some take on Japanese word for knife. I believe this was the very first Gamma film that I ever saw. Certainly not in 1969, again, VHS in the 90s. And this why I have a picture of the VHS that I saw. This is not my VHS copy. I don't own this movie on VHS. I own it on DVD and Blu-ray. But yeah, this was the version that I saw. I quite like this cover for a couple reasons. One is the bottom there. Will Gamera be a super turtle or soup or turtle soup? Also, I just finally, after all these years, noticed that little tagline there up the top. Gamera saves the children once again. I think whoever was doing this, who was writing these taglines, was probably like, "What else am I going to write about these movies?" Of course, Gamera's always saving the children in these movies. I thought that was pretty funny. But Giron is actually probably about as well known as Gauss is. Only because you can see Gamera on there. He's this giant monster with a knife for a head. And boy, does he give it to Gamera and Gauss, because Gauss also briefly shows up in this film. So, because the Gamera films are geared towards children, Noriaki Yuasa wanted to show the dangers to them of everyday objects. And that's because Giron is basically the equivalent of a giant walking knife. And he does a lot of damage with his blade. Perhaps most infamously, he chopped up a living Gauss into smaller pieces. And so this scene, though, was edited out of some American cuts of the film. Again, no pun intended. Um, as with the previous film, it featured a Western actor acting with a Japanese child, and they basically get on they find this spaceship and they go off into space and they land on another planet in the solar system, and then Giron is there, and then Gamera has to come and save them. Meanwhile, their sister who got left behind is telling the parents, like, the boys got in a spaceship and flew away, and the parents are like, "Yeah, sure, kid. Yeah, I don't believe you." Going back to again, Gamera being the person that the children can trust. Now, there is a couple lines in this film about the children dreaming about there being no traffic accidents. To an American audience, that might seem a little out there. Like, why is a kid dreaming of no traffic accidents? He dreams that, these kids think, oh, well, I bet on this other planet there are no traffic accidents because they're a more evolved species. And then when they come back to Earth, spoilers, they say, again, the Japanese child dreams of there being no traffic accidents amongst his other dreams of like world peace and stuff like that. Well, this is actually a very sobering reality for Japanese children, especially after I learned why he wanted there to be no traffic accidents. I don't want there to be traffic accidents either, but basically what was happening in the 60s and the 70s was, especially Japan, like heavily industrialized, is both parents would be at work, they'd be working all day, and the children have to go to school on their own or be left on their own to be like latchkey kids. Well, unfortunately, there were a lot of the traffic accidents in Japan involving people. A lot of them, unfortunately, involved children. The children would get hit going to school or just playing and stuff like that by cars. I don't think this is true, but I think I did read a statistics which said, like, at one point, I think like 50% of vehicle fatalities in Japan were children. And so that's why children started wearing like the yellow hats. I don't know if they still wear yellow hats to this day. I know they get depicted in like anime and stuff like that with yellow hats. I don't know if they still wear yellow hats or not, but the children in the 60s started wearing yellow hats, at least in the 60s, maybe earlier, but they started wearing yellow hats as they were out and about going to school and stuff as part of their school uniform, to make them more visible to cars and hopefully not get hit by them. And I think it's just such a sad story, especially, hearing like, especially in this movie about even the children don't want there to be traffic incidents. Anyway, it's a little bit of a sobering thing, but I'm glad I watched these movies to know that because I wouldn't have known that otherwise. It's very sobering scene. But anyway, so going back to Science Theater 3000 again, this is probably the highlight of the films that they made fun of because the movie, its plot is outlandish. The dub is equally outlandish in English because it's sort of muffled and stuff like that. So the character is called Cone. He's Officer Cone. The children think of him as a child, so they call him Kon-chan. Chan is sort of like an honorific in Japanese for like child. Well, anyway, because they call him Kon-chan or something like that in the English dub, the Mystery Science Theater 3000 people are like, his name is Corn Job. But and then they also famously came up with their own riff on the Gamera March. I can't just tell you to show the Gamera March, but anyway, they came up with what's called the Gamera song, where they basically put their own lyrics over the Gamera March, like Gamera is filled with meat. Gamera's really neat. Gamera's filled with turtle meat. We all love eating Gamera, that sort of thing. It's probably well known among Gamera fans, but anyway, it's pretty funny. But yeah, that's the Gamera song. Continuing on, we have Gamera versus Jiger in 1970, which is basically Gamera versus a xenomorph, sort of. The xenomorph is basically the titular creature from the Alien franchise. I know I'm a big Alien fan. It's not technically a xenomorph is the name of the creature, but that's how people refer to it usually in common lexicon. Anyway, what I mean by that is first of all, here's Gamera and here's Jiger, and as you can see, going back to the Gamera films being more violent, Gamera has been speared between in both his arms and his legs, because Jiger can shoot spears out of his nose for reasons anyway. But so what happens is this movie is like Gamera the Fantastic Voyage. The Fantastic Voyage, if you're not familiar with that film, was basically a lot of scientists got shrunk miniature wise and they went to a person's body in order to save him. Well, in this movie, again, we're preceding Alien 1979 by 9 years. Gamera's nemesis Jiger implants a baby Jiger into Gamera, just like in the Alien movies, which takes Gamera out of action. Another similar scene in both movies is that they do an X-ray of the person who got the baby put into them, the alien baby put into them, and they basically see a dark blob in the host creature, and they're like, well, what is this? Well, because Gamera is so big, nobody has to get shrunk, but what happens is that these two children, on their own, they take a small submarine, they go into Gamera's mouth, and they go through his body in order to save him. This is actually not the first time a small submarine was featured in a Gamera film. There was also one in Gamera versus Virus as well, and a diving spear would be featured in the following film, Gamera versus Zigra. But for the squeamish, for those you know the Alien, what happens in the Alien movies, there is no chest burster in this movie that comes out of Gamera. Anyway, as with the two movies before it, again, we had a Caucasian actor featured amongst the Japanese actors. So we finally had come to Gamera versus Zigra in 1971, which is basically a waterlogged turtle versus a water grouse. I don't mean that seriously, but I mean is that when I was again, I didn't see. I'll get to when I first saw this movie, but my first encounter with Zigra was an American comic book, a Gamera comic book. I thought he was Gauss to some degree because he looked like Gauss to me. I'm like, is this Gauss? Why does he have two sets of wings? Well, he doesn't have two sets of wings. He has two sets of fins, which I realized now. But even to this day, I think he looks like Gauss to a degree. He just can't fly. But anyway, so this was sort of like the final Showa era Gamera film, sort of, and we'll get to why in a moment. So one final hurrah of sorts with Gamera fighting an alien goblin shark. That's what Gauss actually is. He's a goblin shark, but obviously as a kid, I had no idea what a goblin shark was. Even in my teens, I didn't know what a goblin shark was. The filming largely took place on location at Kamigawa SeaWorld. Actually, this attraction only opened the year prior to this film coming out, and in fact is still in operation today. There was some fan service in this film. Basically, that's what was sometimes referred to as sex appeal. So by this point in the Gamera franchise, children are dragging their parents to these movies, and they want to have something to appeal to the dads, which is why this is like the only. Which is why in this film, the alien protagonist is basically a brainwashed human. Spoilers. Anyway, at one point in the movie, she's running around in a bikini, and then and then for the rest of the film, she's running around in a little mini skirt. So anyway, that I believe that was done intentionally. But anyway, there weren't a lot of fan service in the Gamera films, but this one had it. But basically, this was also the last Gamera film of the Showa era, and I'll get to why I think that in just a moment, even though there was one more movie. So what happened is because this movie studio, Daiei, fell into bankruptcy at this point, They weren't paying the crew, and so because the crew wasn't being paid, after this movie was over, they destroyed the Gamera suit. They destroyed most of the props and all of the costumes. I say allegedly, but I think it's no secret that that's what they did. Also, it's telling that the whole studio burned to the ground shortly thereafter. So anyway, but this is also probably the hardest film to find on VHS or DVD back in the day. Um, the way I first saw it was through the Mystery Science Theater 3000 video recording that they did of this, and I was watching on something called Google Video in the mid 2000s, and this was Google Video was what Google had for their video service before they bought YouTube. So again, that was just how desperate I was to watch this movie because I really want to watch the Gamera films, all of them. So then we got final Gamera movie in 1980 called Gamera Super Monster, which is basically Gamera fighting a Star Destroyer, and I do mean that literally in a sense, Star Destroyer from Star Wars, because here's the movie poster, and as you can see, this is basically just a Star Destroyer. They're not even trying to hide it. And then here's Gamera. They did make a Gamera suit again for this movie, but we'll get to why this is. I don't really think of this as much of a Gamera film. In fact, I think most fans don't even remember this movie uh, as being part of the Gamera franchise because here's a little boy and then there's three alien super women who are there to save the day. But this was basically a no budget clip show. What I mean by that is because in the intervening 9 years from Gamera versus Zigra to 19 to this film, Superman had been super popular. Star Wars had been really popular, so they were going to do one final Gamera film. So they built a very basic Gamera suit. Who spent most of his time flying through space. There were a couple scenes of him on the ground, but mostly just flying through space. But all the fight footage in this film is entirely stock footage. I mean, everything is stock footage. There are no new monsters in this film, as opposed to when Godzilla franchise did something similar. At least they had an original monster that Godzilla fought. But anyway, in this movie, there was no new monsters in this movie. So the film featured a young boy aided by three alien superwomen trying to stop evil aliens on their spaceship Xenon, which is the Star Destroyer. And I don't mind spoiling it. The film ends with Gamera flying into the Xenon, and that's about it. And then the movie ends. And I'm not going to show you a clip, but they had a fun Godzilla little reference to Godzilla with a little like standee that Gamera walks by in one of the few scenes of like original footage, and then this little standee falls over and anyway, it's not Godzilla, it's Dojira, which is kind of funny that they were making fun of the Godzilla franchise and one of the few obvious references from the Gamera to the Godzilla franchise. But anyway, in 1991 though, there was something called Gamera versus Gara Sharp. Now here's the thing though, there was never any Gamera versus Gara Sharp movie. You might see people online, at least probably not so much anymore, but back in the day when I was online, using the internet, of course, everything on the internet is true. At least that's what I thought in those days. What happened was is that when they came out with the Gamera Laserdisc release in Japan, there's a group called the Gamera Japanese. There was a Japanese group who was the Gamera Preservation Society, and I don't quite know what that is, but I'm guessing they're probably just a bunch of like hardcore Gamera fans. Anyway, they put together a short video of a Gamera film that never came out, but jokingly they said that this was going to be footage for a upcoming Gamera film, which obviously there was never going to be a Gamera film called Gamera versus Gara Sharp. But what happened was is they had the whole plot laid out. They showed storyboards of this movie, and then they used a couple of maquettes, which you can see here, to actually portray Gamera and Gara Sharp. So I don't know if I first learned about this in the late 90s or the early 2000s. Regardless, I assume everything on the internet is true, and somebody said that this was an actual Gamera film that never came out, and I believed it. And I think even the person who did it probably believed it too, but didn't realize, oh wait a minute, this was never meant to be a movie. But I'd encourage you to seek out this clip of Gamera versus Gara Sharp, like this little preservation, like this little short film that they made. I think it's like 9 minutes or something. But yeah, I think it's actually pretty well put together, and I could believe why someone would think that this was supposed to be a movie, because that's what they made it seem like this was supposed to be a movie, but this was never supposed to be a movie. But I think the idea of I think the idea of Gamera fighting what looks like fighting like an anaconda, I think actually is a very, I actually like that idea, and I wouldn't mind seeing it someday actually as a full-fledged movie. Now we're moving on though. So now there's a 15-year gap from the Gamera versus Super Monster to the Heisei era, which was from 1995 to 1999 for the Gamera franchise. So that leads us to Gamera, the Guardian of the Universe, which came out in 1995, which is a modern turtle for a modern age, even if it was 30 years ago at this point. And boy, did this movie poster catch my attention in the mid to late 90s. So I learned about Gamera, like the new Gamera films, if through a comic book. And as soon as I American comic book, and as soon as I saw this poster, I'm like, I have to have this movie. I have to have this movie. I gotta go out. I gotta go find it. I gotta do whatever I can to get my hands on Gamera, and the giant Guardian of the Universe, because I love this poster. This was like, this is so exciting. I have to see this movie. So I called every place I could in my little hometown, and not little hometown, in my hometown, and nobody had it. And I think eventually I found like a specialty video store, and they were able to get their hands on it. Although I think by this point it actually had an official U.S. release. But again, I only had access to the internet, but I didn't know how to use it to look up this sort of thing. So, but anyway, so I got my hands on this VHS tape and I loved it. This is one of my, this is my, if this is probably my second favorite Gamera film after Gamera versus Baragon. So what happened was we had the new wave. So starting in 1984, the Godzilla franchise had relaunched itself with a string of successful movies in their Heisei era. Now this era, though, we talked about how in the Showa era, the Godzilla franchise was basically reaching its creative peak when the Gamera franchise started. Well, in this case, the Heisei era was coming to a close as the new Gamera films are being launched. The final Godzilla movie of the Showa era came out in 1995, which was the same year that this Gamera film came out. That's because the Godzilla franchise was coming to an end, the Heisei era, because they're going to make the American Godzilla movie. But anyway, so Daiei Films, again, I'm a little hazy on their corporate history, but they had emerged from bankruptcy and they were going to put their money into a monster movie, and they decided to put it into Gamera because that was the most popular giant monster that they had. So Shusuke Kaneko, who was the director of horror and adult pictures, he lobbied to direct the new film. He'd been a big fan of Gamera as a child. Now, supposedly, though, he'd also asked Toho during the Heisei era, the Godzilla films, could he direct a film, but they turned him down. So special effects were done by a guy called Shinji Higuchi, who had actually done some uncredited work as like a temp or like a ringer on Godzilla, Return of Godzilla in 1984. But anyway, so this movie was given a healthy budget. It wasn't Godzilla sized, but it was very decent, and because of that, they had to have Gauss return. I heard supposedly that Kaneko wanted to use an original monster to fight Gamera, but owing to box office concerns, they were going to use Gamera's most well-known opponent, and there was reason for this because when the Heisei Godzilla movies were coming out, some movies had original monsters and some of them had older, like classic monsters. Some of them had both, but they found that the movies that had the classic monsters did better at the box office because people, of course, they want to go see Mothra, they want to go see King Ghidorah, they want to see Mechagodzilla, they didn't want to see like these original monsters. So that's why they had Gauss in it. Now the other thing though is, go back to Baragon being more serious, is that these movies were treated more seriously. There were no children in these movies. These movies were more mature. Gauss ate people, and he actually did eat people. Unlike the Showa era Gauss, which was done tastefully. No, Gauss ate people in this movie. Uh, but basically, so the Noriaki Yuasa, who directed the Showa era films, he was still alive, and he said he didn't like this decision. He was not happy about this. He thought Gamera should be for children, and this movie was very much geared towards teenagers and adults. Basically, this was a PG-13 movie. So this is the main female protagonist. So there wasn't a child in it, but there was a teenager. And the actor's name was Ayako Fujitani, and she played a character called Asaki Kusanagi. Ayako is the daughter of Steven Seagal, if you know who that is, and because of that, she actually can't speak English. There are interviews with her on YouTube of her, because she can speak English, so you can listen to interviews with her on YouTube. I think she was also going to be at G-Fest this past year. I know she had to cancel one year. I don't know if she made it this year or she'll make it in the future, but she has gone to some, conventions here in the U.S. There's footage of that online as well, and because she can speak English, you don't have to worry about translations or anything. She's still alive today. She does act. She had no desire to be an actor originally. This was her first movie. She was discovered at like some ceremony honoring her grandfather, who was a well-known martial artist in Japan, and that's how they found her. But she does act till to this day. I mean, she doesn't act, I don't know if she acts regularly, but she acts off and on. But she is still acting. She was in a movie called Man from Reno, which I think you can watch on Hoopla for those of you who have Hoopla as part of the library service that we offer here. But this was the 30th anniversary of the Gamera franchise. The movie cost 4.5 million to make and did 6 million at the box office, which at least it made money. Now, it did make its way to the United States, and I'm uncertain if it ever had a limited theatrical run or else it was shown at art house cinemas. And I only say that because Siskel and Ebert reviewed this movie. 'Cause of course, we're in Chicagoland, and Siskel and Ebert, of course, they're Chicago-based movie critics. I would encourage you to seek out their review on YouTube. You may be surprised by whether or not they enjoyed this movie or not. You might be surprised. It may not be what you think it was. So then a year later, we had Gamera 2, Attack a Legion in 1996. This is not a still from the movie. I'm sorry I don't have credit for this, whose picture this is. So if you're watching this later, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to steal your photo, but I will say I thought it was a very well done photo. This is somebody who took their Gamera toy and their Legion toy, which is there on the right, and they depicted it like a scene from the movie. And I thought this did a good job of demonstrating both monsters, better so than I could find a still from the movie depicting the two of them. But so again, more monsters. Boy, nothing but typos in this presentation. More monsters, more battles. So upon reflection of how the first film went, the decision was made to have more monster battles in this one. So they introduced a new creature called Legion, which came from outer space. I think someone said at one point they were thinking about having Giron in this movie, and obviously some people said no, that was never going to be the case. But regardless, it's possible Giron being a space monster inspired Legion, which was a space monster, as opposed to Gauss, who was not a space monster. This movie is also somewhat based on an old Japanese science fiction show called Ultra Q, which was the predecessor to Ultraman. But anyway, only Ayako Fujitani returned from the previous film in any major role. This movie had a little bit of a higher budget of $5 million, but still only made $6 million at the box office. Now, what is the Lake Texarkana Gamera dub? So what happened was when this movie was dubbed into English, I think in like the late 90s, early 2000s, the company who did it, they're based out of Houston. They like to sometimes do humorous like dub clips of like the movies that they were doing, whether it was live action or anime. Well, so basically what they thought was they thought it would be funny, some of the actors to come together, and they dubbed almost the entire movie as a joke, as all the characters were a bunch of stereotypical redneck hillbillies, and that's why they call it Lake Texarkana. And so basically, it's patently offensive. There's swearing all over the place, and basically takes what was a PG-13 movie and pushes it into rated R territory. I have seen this dub, although not in its entirety, although but I will say this: if you seek it out, you did so because you chose to, not because I told you to. So just know it is patently offensive, and it was designed to be that way. So, but anyway, it certainly makes a very interesting movie when you hear most of the characters acting like a bunch of stereotypical rednecks. But anyway, but around this time though, we had a Dark Horse Comics mini series, and this is what again let me know that there was a new Gamera movie that came out. I have all four of these. These are actually in reverse order. The issue 1 is on the right, and issue 4 is on the left. But I own all of these. I actually really like this mini series. I can't go too much into it, but basically, Gamera fought Gauss again. This is basically designed to take place in the Heisei era films between the Gamera and Gamera guarding the universe and Gamera versus Legion. But basically, Gamera fights Gauss, Gamera fights Zigra, and Gamera fights Virus, and sort of a Heisei era sort of thing. And I really like these comics. I know some people don't, but I enjoyed them. I enjoyed them as a kid, and I enjoy them today. But I do acknowledge that they're faults, if you will. And all these cover art is actually was done for the as artwork for the Gamera Guardian of the Universe film, because if you've ever seen the movie, you probably recognize some of these scenes from that movie. But unfortunately, it didn't. It was a mini series. The Dark Horse who made them said they were going to make more Gamera comics, and they just didn't. I suspect because they may not have sold all that well. But at least they were able to use the Gamera monsters in it, though. But anyway, so in 1997 there was a PlayStation game for the PlayStation that came out in Japan called Gamera 2000. I have played this game. I actually did enjoy this game. What's interesting though is this game never came out in the United States, even though in the Japanese version all the menus are in English and all the acting is in English. So it's very import friendly because you don't have to really know much Japanese. The only Japanese in here is on the cover and in the manual. In fact, even maybe the manual might be in English too. I don't remember, but anyway, the game is entirely in English. But you can watch clips of it online. So we come to one final Gamera film of the Heisei era trilogy, which was Revenge of Iris in 1999. There's Gamera fighting Iris. This is actually a still from the movie, or at least a depiction of the monsters as they were in the movie. So this was basically the new millennium. So rounding out the Gamera Heisei trilogy, there was one final film made in 1999. Gauss did return, albeit in a limited capacity. There was a new monster, Iris, which was born out of a young girl's quest for revenge against Gamera. Why she wanted revenge against Gamera? She had a perfectly legitimate reason for it, but she was also doing it for the wrong reasons as well. But anyway, I encourage you to seek out why she wanted revenge against Gamera. But as far as who Iris was and how did Iris relate to the Gauss is never explained. I find that a little frustrating, but it was never fully laid out. But maybe it's better that it wasn't, so we can use our imagination. Ayako Fujitani returned once more as Asagi Kusanagi. And then this movie though, sort of like Baragon, it was more like heavy on the human drama and less so the monsters. It was also very steeped in the Chinese lore about the four guardians that I said at the beginning of the presentation. And spoilers, it ended on a cliffhanger that was never to be resolved. Now, I know there are people out there, and I want them to keep thinking this way. There are people there. I've seen reviews online where people say this is the best Gamera film of all time, and this is the best of the Gamera trilogy. I just don't feel the same way personally. I didn't like it when I first saw it, but it has grown on me though. I think it's the lack of Gamera and monster battles is really the big downside, which is interesting considering people use that same criticism level of Gamera versus Baragon. I just, for whatever reason, it works for me in Baragon and it doesn't really work for me here. But I have liked this movie and I will have to watch it again. It is growing on me, so it's not like I don't like this film. And if you really like this film, it's your favorite. I want you to keep thinking that way. I usually say for me personally, it's just not my favorite of the Gamera trilogy, but it's still a good movie. It's still a solid movie by all means. Although it's also worth noting out that Godzilla 2000, a Japanese Godzilla movie, came out in Japan the same year, and it did twice as much at the box office, which I think shows that Godzilla is just much more popular franchise than Gamera is. That was just a scene of Gamera coming to fight Iris. Some good special effects though. It's just Gamera wasn't in it all that much. But the good news though for Kaneko is who directed the Gamera trilogy. In 2001, he was able to direct his own Godzilla movie called Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, and it was part of what's called the Millennium series, and it was very well received. I liked it. I don't love it, but I liked it. It's also worth pointing out that this movie features guardian monsters, just like the four guardian monsters as well. Except there's only three guardian monsters in this movie. What's interesting though, you're looking at that monster at the bottom right, and you're thinking to yourself, "Oh, that's Barugan from Gamera versus Barugan, my favorite Gamera film." And like, no, that's Baragon. That is not. It's not Baragon. It's Baragon. Even though how Toho could have a movie called with a monster spelled Bargon with a horn on his head, and Gamera franchise could have a monster spelled Barugon with a horn on his head. I don't know, but that's what happened. But anyway, so yeah, he got directed the movie. This is usually regarded as the best of the Millennium series, and I do like it. I think and it gets another case where the film's grown on me. Shinji Higuchi did not do the special effects for this movie. However, did co-direct a Godzilla movie as well, not just do the special effects in 2016. He co-directed the movie called Shin Godzilla, and this movie did very well at the box office. It was until Godzilla Minus One came out. It was like the highest grossing Godzilla movie in Japan, and he actually won basically the equivalent of the Japanese Academy Awards. He won Best Director along with his co-director Ano Hideaki. Oh, shoot, Hideki Anno, I think is his name. God, I'm mispronouncing his name anyway. But yeah, so he co-won a Japanese Academy Award for directing the Shin Godzilla. So now we're moving on to the Millennium Era in 2006, and that was it for the Gamera franchise in 2006 because we had the movie called Gamera the Brave. Gamera the Brave was a return to form, as we can see here with the child depicted on the poster. Gamera fights a creature called Zedeus, or Zedeus. I haven't seen this movie in a while, but basically what happens is this movie was a return to the Showa era roots. This was basically featured again young children in a more PG type movie. This might have possibly been done as a reaction to the Heisei era being Gamera trilogy being more mature. I don't know. But anyway, this Gamera had an origin story. Gauss appears at the very beginning. Giron sort of makes an appearance, and if you watch the movie, I'll see if you can figure out what I'm referring to. The main villain monster is that sort of lizard monster called Zadis. This movie tanked at the box office. There's no sugarcoating it. It tanked. only the Japanese box office. It only came out on DVD and Blu-ray here in the U.S. and never made it to theaters. As for my thoughts, I enjoyed it. I mean, I wasn't blown away by it, but it was a solid story with a bunch of children. I need to watch it. I think I've watched it like once or maybe twice. I just need to get revisited sometime. Um, but anyway, that brings us to the Reiwa era, which was from 2023 until hopefully today and beyond. If you don't know, these eras roughly correspond to the names of the Japanese emperors. So the Showa dynasty, I think is what it was like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The 90s to the mid 2000 or whatever it was called the Heisei era, and basically now we're in the Showa era of the Showa dynasty or emperor. Again, it relates to the Japanese emperors, except for the Millennium series, which was just done to distinguish that from the Heisei era, even though in Japan it was still the Heisei era. But anyway, so it leads us with Gamera Rebirth, which was from 2023 to 2024, which was the first Gamera TV series, and it was on Netflix and it was animated. This basically reimagined a lot of the classic Gamera monsters, although Baragon isn't in it, which is really too bad. It was like the one monster they left out for whatever reason. That's Gamera making mincemeat out of Jiger there at the top. Gauss is on the right. I think that's Zigra there on the bottom right. Of course, Giron is pretty easily distinguishable there on the left. And I think that might be Virus there on the fully left. And I think that's a new monster in the background. Why I say I'm not sure about these things is because this was on Netflix and I don't currently have Netflix access. I have not watched this series. It was an animated TV series of 6 episodes. It was Netflix exclusive. Again, it featured children and several Showa era monsters reimagined. I think the Gamera fans who watched this, I think, did enjoy it. Although it's worth pointing out, though, that while Netflix doesn't report their viewing numbers publicly, it seems like it didn't do all that well. Supposedly, the budget got cut too. I think they had to condense the number of episodes. Again, that's just what I heard. I'm not saying it's true, but that's what I read anyway. Now, there's also, again, going to perhaps not doing all that well viewing wise. Now, there's been no sequel series that's been announced. What's interesting is that when they were going to announce this like revival, Shusuke Kaneko, who directed the Heisei Gamera films, he did offer around that time to say he was willing to direct another Gamera film again. But when he found out they were making this project, he respectfully, backed out, his respect to the people who are making the animated films. But anyway. Of course, before that, they had released a concept trailer for something else, which was Gamera fighting a bunch of Gauss again saving a child and their parent. What that was for, I don't know. I don't know if it was proof of concept for something or what, but regardless, we ended up with the Gamera Rebirth. So what is the future though? Are we ever going to see Gamera fight Godzilla in a movie? I'd say probably not. Supposedly, the Dai has occasionally said to Toho, like, if you want him to fight, we'd be interested. But Toho has always said no. I think the reason why is they got nothing to get out of it. I mean, Godzilla is more popular than Gamera. There's just no getting around that. Now, that doesn't mean there have been official like crossovers between the two, though. There have been some mobile games that have come out lately. I think only in Japan. I don't think they've come out in the U.S. But basically, there have been some mobile games like for iOS and Android where Godzilla is like the main monster, but they've allowed Gamera to appear in them unlicensed from Katakawa Dai Studio. But yeah, but also but it would be interesting to see. I would like to see this movie. Again, I don't think it's ever going to happen, but I would like to see this movie. There was also a video game that came out for the PlayStation 3 only in Japan. I think it's called City Enshrouded in Shadow or something like that, where basically it was like characters were trying to escape the city, but this game was able to license characters from Godzilla, Gamera, Ultraman, Patlabor, and Evangelion. And basically what happens is, so in one scene, in one level, Godzilla's wrecking the place, or Mecha Godzilla, and another level, Gamera and Gauss are wrecking the place. Or even I think Legion was in it too or something. Anyway, but there's no crossover though in those levels. Each level is its own like franchise. But anyway, so there's been some crossovers between the two. I want to see them fight. I want Gamera to be in its own equivalent of the MonsterVerse we have here in the United States. But with that, I'll say that's the end of this presentation. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And I want Gamera to continue. I want there to be more Gamera films. I like the Gamera franchise, and I hope it'll continue into the future. So I'll just turn on my camera briefly just to say goodbye. And like they said in the movie, in Mystery Science Theater 3000, Gamera is really neat. Gamera is filled with meat. We all love you, Gamera. All right, bye everybody. See ya. Bye bye.